As the kit part was totally inadequate, I imported some images of the real thing on two planes, side and top, and traced the outline of the main body, and extruded a profile and cut the slots for the levers into the top. The kit part was just totally non-existent, and the photo etch was just absolute. It was just, as I said in a previous video, it's like there was a lot missing that should have been there. But here I'm adding the various components as I go along, matching them to the pictures as best I can. I have to work with something that has questionable perspective on it, because there's no reference points on there. But as I'm going along, I'm adding the levers, which I would use. I create a sphere or a cylinder, and then push and pull the polygons, and then add more faces to them to make the edges smoother. I add the levers as well, and I've made the levers a little bit thicker than they should be, just so that when I print them, they're going to be really, really thin. It's just so I don't destroy them while handling it. So I'm adding the various dials and knobs to it, and various details, adding screws, which you can just make out on the finished item. So these, there's I think there's 5 visible screws on the front of it. That's the friction knob, so you dial that up or down for more or less friction on the levers, if you want it to move smoothly or a little bit more stiffly. It's a personal preference for the pilot, I guess. I don't quite know what all these levers do. I do know that this little component here has a latch on it, which, looking at the reference images, you can see quite clearly there. So I guess you would put your hand around the lever, pull up on the latch, and then you can move it backwards and forwards. And so that's pretty much all the detail gone into this part, with the exception of the little ball that goes in the end of that last lever. There's a couple of tabs underneath that during fitting seemed to be a bit on the. That's another bit of detail on the top of the throttle body. I think it's a friction spring, so that when you push the throttle all the way forward, it stays there and doesn't get rattled out of place, I think. Anyway, so that's the finished model, and then from there we go into the slicer. What the slicer does is it takes your 3D model and literally, as it says, it cuts it into layers that the 3D printer will then use to create the model. As you can see, that's pretty tiny. This is the smallest version of the throttle body that I made, of the unit that I made. The first one had point to point between the trapezoidal shape of the main body. It was 3.5 mil. I brought one down to about 3.2 or 3.4. Oh, it's 3.7, then 3.5, and then this one's down to like 3.175. So this is quite small. Now you notice I'm angling this thing on the build plate. The build plate being the grey floor. That's actually, you're viewing it upside down. When it builds it, it'll build hanging upside down from what you're seeing here. What I'm doing is I'm angling the part in such a way that the supports, that I use minimum supports and can get the best detail out of it. So the more supports you have to put on it, the more it will, the more you have to clean up afterwards. So here I'm using a mixture of medium supports for, when I say medium, it's medium size. There's 3 sizes you can choose from: medium, large, and small. I'm using a few medium-sized supports to take the bulk of the strain during the printing. Because what happens is that the bottom of the, I'll show this later in the video, but the bottom of the print will be essentially glued to the bottom of the tank. So it has to separate that, and to overcome those forces, you have to add supports on there, as well as to make sure that any overhangs can be printed properly. So I'm just adding like smaller supports to the back of vulnerable components, just to ensure that they actually stay where they're supposed to stay. And those are the parts that I ended up having to remove because they just got a little bit too close to the side console. And that's just adjusting them a little bit, making sure that when I place them that they don't intersect with the model itself or each other too much. Because if they get too close to each other, they can sort of form a web and connect and be a pain to remove. So I'm quite happy with that now. So what I will do is, while I'm at it, I will add another couple to the build plate. So because while I'm busy, I may as well print a few more. It takes exactly the same amount of time on this printer to print 1 or 10. I think this is this is the medium size one, I think. I did several. Yeah, this is the medium sized one. Then I save it export it as a file specific for this printer, which is the Anycubic Photon. It's calculating the layers now, and now what I'm going to do is just run through the finished file to see what happens. So what you're seeing here is as I'm going up, it's showing each separate layer as it builds up the parts. And that's pretty much it. And from here we go down to the printer. If you'll bear with me on this one, because I'm going handheld. This is the Photon, the Anycubic Photon, the printer I use for my parts these days. It's a LCD printer. Underneath here is a UV LED that shines through an LCD panel, which masks off the layers, like I showed in the slicer, into the bottom of a tank of resin, and then the builds are then adhered to that, which drops down into the vat of resin. Now, it's very easy to set this. I choose the file I want, which in this case is these. These are the throttle bodies, throttle controls, and hit play. What I'll do, slight notes in 6.5 seconds, exposure to 100mm bottom layers. I need to switch that to. See if that makes a bit of a difference. I'm just tweaking the exposure times. I found that the ones on the previous ones are a little bit soft, which could mean it's either could be underexposing or overexposing, that the light is sort of bleeding out from all the edges. Anyway, so as that goes down, slowly, it'll drop itself into the resin. In fact, I can open this, but it'll see what's going on there. It goes down and sploosh. Down, swishes the resin a bit. Now what it'll do, it's going to expose the first layer for about 100 seconds, so it really overexposes it and welds it to the build plate. And then after the first 10 or so layers, it will then expose at a lower resolution, a lower rate. which then in about an hour and a half should give us our parts, and I'll come back then to release them from the plate and show you how the post-processing works. Well, the print's finished. It finished about half an hour ago. And there they all are, hanging upside down from the build plate. And my massive shiny head in the background. The sound over there is a different 3D printer. That's a F4U-1A. It's one of several machines we have here. But this one is mine. Right, so the next step is we take the build plate off. There we go. That there for a second. Close this. You don't want too much light getting into there because it ruins the UV sensitive resin. And we take our scraper and gently peel it off like that. Place that there, and place it there in the alcohol, and let that soak for a bit. Open this. Put the build plate back. And that's now ready for a new print. Meanwhile, these are soaking. You have to use isopropyl alcohol to dissolve and wash away the excess resin. There's 2 tanks in here, one for the initial wash and then one for the rinse. As these are small parts, there's not that much that needs to be washed off of them. There you go, there's another 10 on there. And these actually look really nice. So all the details are on there. You can barely make it out. And to give these a little bit more of a rinse. You leave them in too long, they degrade and go all floppy and disintegrate. No. So you can just make out all the details in there. I think these might actually be nicer than the ones I've already printed. I think the detail might be a little bit sharper because I use a little bit less of an exposure on them. It's hard to tell until you get some paint on them. But I think they might actually be a little bit nicer. So I might pry the one off that I glued into the aircraft and then use one of these instead. But we're not quite done yet. We need to post-cure them because they come out, they're very squishy. You don't want it to be too exposed because, as I said, the light sort of transmits through the resin, and you get it softens details. And if you use underexposed, it softens detail as well. Don't get enough detail. So it's finding that little sweet spot to get the right settings. Can you see the on the top there, all the slots for the levers in there? Still a bit moist on top, but that's fine. So So to post-cure them, you go into one of these, which is a simple UV nail bath, normally meant for resin nails. It's on a timer. There they sit for about 3 minutes while they think about what they've done. And when they're done in here, they're ready to go. So what I might do this evening when I get home is separate one and paint it, so you can see what it looks like when it's all painted. So you can see the actual details on the model. So yeah, that was how I 3D print my own parts. This is actually really the first proper time I've done it, and it's come out successfully. So yeah, more on this later. Well, I'm home now, having printed these this afternoon. I did 2 batches. I did a batch where the exposure was set to 6 seconds, and one where the batch where the exposure was set to 6.5 seconds. I'm not sure if there's a huge difference between the two, but I'm going to paint one of the 6-second ones up just to show you what it looks like when it's got some paint on it, if I can keep the thing in frame. Now, this resin takes paint pretty well, so there's no real need to prime it unless you want to get rid of some of the surface blemishes. When I say blemishes, I mean the build lines, if you can call them that. So this method of printing involves, as I said earlier, an LCD panel that masks and unmasks. And of course, because it's an LCD panel, it's pixelated. So if you look really, really closely, I'm not sure you can on this, but you can make it out by eye. You can see there's a sort of a matte texture to it. There, you can barely make out the those little lines on there. If you look closely, it sort of looks like the thing is made out of Lego blocks. We have to look really, really, really close. But a bit of paint, and in this case I'm going to start with some Vallejo black grey, because as you know I don't really like painting straight blacks, especially on tiny things like this. A bit of airbrush thinners to help the flow a bit. What was I saying? Yeah, a bit of paint can help fill in those details, or fill in those blemishes on the surface, if you can call them blemishes. So I'm going to start with a coat of the dark black grey, and I've added a little bit of airbrush thinners to it just to make it flow a little bit easier, which is helpful especially with the teeny tiny details, especially in the grooves where the levers move backwards and forwards. Now, I've already glued one of these into my cockpit, but I might just replace it with this one later down the line, or one from the same batch. Just want to make sure there's not too much paint on there. Yeah, you can see now that you can see the detail of the tracks, as it were, in there. It's come out really nicely. I originally printed a set at 7 seconds, and the detail on that, while very nice, is still a bit fluffy around the edges, a bit round. Yeah, a bit rounded. Because what happens is the light will enter the model, and it will, once it's cured, it'll then go up and then start expanding out. because it scatters inside the liquid. And there's a little nub in there from where it was fixed to the base. So yeah, it starts expanding outward, and when it does so, it will bloom, as it were. Because you've got to think of it as a thick liquid. Oh, there we go. Which means that as the light transmits through the liquid, it will solidify any resin it comes across, which is how you get sort of soft and fuzzy details. Not sure I used the correct one for that. I thought I'd go with some MIG polished metal for some of these components. I'm not entirely sure that's the way to go. So I'm going to go with Vallejo oily steel, as per my reference. Now I'll show you the difference between this one and one I painted yesterday. That's better. Just give you an idea of what that entails. That extra time of exposure. So this will go on here. This is a 3D printing. Tiny things like this is excellent for creating such. Come on, focus. There we go. Creating such tiny things, because these are something we found out on Isle of Dogs. It's perfect for creating parts that are extremely hard to reproduce en masse. So if it's very hard to mold it and cast it without breaking it all the time, then 3D printing the part is a much easier way to go about it, and much more cost effective, because there's less waste. Granted, you will still have all the support material that goes with it, but on Isle of Dogs we reused that stuff anyway. It was all used on Trash Island. So there's very little on that show that hasn't been... There's very few scenes in that show that doesn't have something of mine in it, which is nice. Let me see if I can brighten this up with the polished metal. There we go. Now you want to keep your paints thin, otherwise you end up burying all that lovely detail that you've worked so hard to model and print. Yeah, that's better. This lighting is a terrible setup for demonstrating stuff. I do apologise. One day, when I'm grown up, I might get a decent light setup. Until then, I'm going to have to make do with this. I do apologise. Now, so that is metal coloured, and then there's a teeny tiny little catch at the bottom here, which I highlighted in the 3D modelling section of this video. So I'm going to pick that out. Yeah, that's all right. What could possibly go wrong? Then when this is done, I will paint that little ball with some red. Yeah, this is going on all right. In fact, I do prefer this one to the one I printed the other day. The details are just a little bit crisper on it. Yeah, I'll replace the one that I've put in there with one of these. And now we know. 6 seconds is all you need per layer. At the layer time, exposure time, relies heavily on how much resin there is, or how much layer resin you need to expose. The thinner the layer, the less resin there is, therefore the less exposure time is necessary. Now, the basic settings for this particular resin is 10 seconds per 50 microns. Now I printed these at 30 microns. Now 30 microns is, what is that? Trying to work the maths out in my head, but I've had a very long day. Anyway, if 50 is 50 microns is 20 per millimeter, then 20 microns is 50 per millimeter. So I'm going to go with 30. Someone can tell me in the comments. I'm broken at the moment. Either way, that's a lot of lines per mil. Right, so that's those. Now I need to make a little browny red color for the what I assume is a Bakelite. Oops. There, steady. Bakelite knob. Which do I have a color that will simulate that? There we go. That one might work. What is this? Rust brown. Not sure. I had a nice one yesterday. I will go with a little bit of brown blaze and red. Both Vallejo colours. Because the reference is a nice sort of dark red. Well, it's Bakelite, so you know what that looks like. So a dark reddy kind of colour. Oops. For a glaze, it's very gloopy, this stuff. Anyway, let's put that there. I'll put that. That is there. And that's all we need. When this is all on, I will give it a wash with some black or Nuln oil. There we go. That's that. And then I believe these knobs here, that one and these, were a glossy black Bakelite. I'll use black on that because then there's a little bit of contrast. I won't go too mad. I say this every time, of course. A bit of Vallejo black. There we go. There. Oh, this is way better than the one I did yesterday. So I keep experimenting with these just to get them just right. I'm still working out the minigun barrels. I might use a different machine for that because of it's also a case of dialing the exposure in properly. I might try that at a 6 or a 5 second exposure on those, because there's a on the 48 scale ones, there's a hole that goes right down the barrels, down the barrel cluster, down the barrel clamp, so you can see straight through to the inside of it, and that just keeps flashing over, so that is an indication that the exposure is still too high. Let's give that a moment. In the meantime, I'll put a bit of a wash in there just to highlight it, which I have right here. Some Nuln oil. Now, if anyone's interested, I will consider. Oh, look at that. I'll consider selling these at some point. They'll be pretty cheap, I mean, considering they're teeny tiny. I can do loads at the same time, so it's not so much the time, it's the materials involved. And I'll test various other materials, although this green stuff is one of the best, one of the easiest ones to work with, apparently. I've only had the machine a few weeks, but I have had plenty of experience with other 3D printers. As I said, for a year I was in charge of the 3D printers at 3 Mills doing Isle of Dogs, which was an experience. Met Wes Anderson once, briefly, only showed up a few times. At the time I was sort of goofing off and was working on on a model of a F4U-1A Thunder Chief. I was actually using the 3D printers there to prototype some nose cones, because the Hobby Boss and Trumpeter nose cones, there's the Trumpeter kit. The Hobby Boss kit, are notoriously misshapen. They're a bit too pointy. So I reshaped it and then printed them, and I was test fitting one to see how it flowed. The door flies open, producer comes in and goes, "And this is Mike, he does a 3D printing." Producer steps aside, and there, standing in a purple corduroy suit, was Wes Anderson himself. So I tossed the 105 behind my drawing tablet, and stood up and gave him the brief tour of my teeny tiny little printing room, which was about the same size as my hobby room. No, it's actually a bit small. No, it was about the same size, but it was isolated and didn't have anyone to talk to. So that was interesting. There we go. I might put a little dry brush, maybe. Yeah, this is the way to go. This is the way forward. I'll let this dry. I'll take some close-up pictures because it's hard to really tell down here. Let me see if I can get a better light on it. Yeah, you see that? That's quite nice. I'm pleased with that. Yeah, that'll do nicely. Yeah, anything else I'll do off camera, because that's, I mean, there's not much else to cover in this at this point in time. Oh wait, hang on, there's a tiny little clip, spring clip at the back there that I need to paint, which I'll use a finer brush for. Is this going to work? No, that one's very ruined. I said the other day, there's two things I do well. One of them is ruin brushes. I'm still trying to figure out what the other one is. There we go, a bit of this stuff, a bit of the polished metal, because this is a spring. As I explained in the video, there's a spring on here that helps with holding the throttle lever in place at higher RPM. At least that's what I think it is. I don't really know. If anyone does know, I'll gladly hear from them. That goes there, bit of this, bit of the old silver there now. So that's that, and then across the front of this is a ratchet. That's spring, or at least that I might have gone on a bit heavy-handed, but that's fine. For the purpose of this demonstration, it'll do. But yeah, that's it. That is the 3D printed F4U Corsair throttle quadrant, which I am quite pleased with. It makes a huge improvement to the kit part, which, as I said the other day, just does not exist. So yeah, what I'll do is I will use this one, set it aside for now. I'll pull that one out. All right, let me see if I can do a comparison between this one and the one I did the other day. Yeah, honestly, there's not much in it. Yeah, there's not that much. You can tell that the little screws on this one are a little bit more defined, as are the little tracks, little slots for the levers are also a little bit more defined. So this is the way to go. I'll go with the 6-second one. So yes, as I said, nope, damn it, that is 3D printing custom parts for my aircraft.